and thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. Today I am talking about Salem's Lot by Stephen King, and this was only his second ever published novel. It was published in 1975, and I'm comparing it with the 2024 adaptation directed by Gary Dauberman. And Salem's Lot is about author Ben Mears, who comes back to his childhood hometown of Jerusalem's Lot in search for some inspiration for his next book, when he discovers that the people of the town are mysteriously being turned into blood-sucking vampires. And earlier this week, I released a video sharing my thoughts on the two miniseries that have been adapted from this book, so you should definitely check out that video. And like I say in that video, I loved this book and I would highly recommend it. As far as the new movie goes, my spoiler-free thoughts, I thought this movie was just all right. In my opinion, it doesn't hold up well as an adaptation of Salem's Lot, but it also doesn't hold up very well just as like a vampire movie. So on both fronts, I was just kind of disappointed. It's not the worst thing I've ever seen though, so if you were already planning on watching it, I'm not going to convince you not to. Like, it's less than 2 hours long. If you already have a Max subscription, then sure, watch it. But yeah, I just thought it was okay. Out of the adaptations that have been made of Salem's Lot, my personal favorite is the 1979 miniseries. But before I get into the details of the movie, I first want to talk about just the book for a second, and I will be getting into spoilers, so from here on out, we will have spoilers going forward. But King was inspired to write this book after he read Dracula for the second time, and he read it with his class when he was teaching English. And in the author's note, King writes, "I wanted to tell a tale that inverted Dracula. In Stoker's novel, the optimism of Victorian England shines through everything like a newly invented electric light. Ancient evil comes to the city and is sent scattering, not without some struggle, it is true, by thoroughly modern vampire hunters who use blood transfusions and stenography and typewriting machines. My novel could look through the other end of the telescope at a world where electric lights and modern inventions would actually aid the incubus by rendering belief in him all but impossible." And he also goes on to say how he loves the part in Dracula when the group gets together and they chase Dracula down, which is funny because the part in the book when they actually are on the move chasing Dracula, I thought that's when the book kind of got less interesting, and the last quarter of the book Dracula I think kind of drags. So it's funny that he specifically talked about how much he loved that part of it. But I do like in that part that I just read, I like how he talks about how Stoker, he brought the character of Dracula to England from Transylvania so that this old world monster could be pitted against the then modern world of Victorian England. And so I hadn't thought of it that way when I read Dracula. So I was kind of like, why can't the people of Transylvania beat him, right? Like, why did it have to be these highly educated English gentlemen who were finally able to get Dracula, right? But when you look at it, that's the whole point, is Stoker, again, bringing this old world monster into the new world, and he can't make it in the new world, right? With all these new inventions and things. And so yeah, next time I read Dracula, I will have that in my mind, as that is why these guys in England are able to defeat Dracula when the Transylvanians couldn't. But then I love that King reverses this, right? Because by the 70s, modern technology actually hinders the humans more than helping them in many ways. And in this author's note, he then goes on to say, "In my story, the vampires would probably win and good luck to them. However, the story didn't quite turn out that way, as you will see for yourself, because some of my human characters turned out to be stronger than I expected. It took a certain amount of courage to allow them to grow towards each other as they wanted to, but I found that courage. If I ever won a single battle as a novelist, that was it. Writers have found it so much easier to imagine doom in the year since World War II, and especially in the year since Vietnam. Easier to imagine characters who grow smaller as a result of their trials rather than bigger. Ben Mears, I discovered, wanted to be big. Wanted, in fact, to be a hero. I let him be what he wanted, and I have never been sorry." And so I love that section too that he writes, because I personally tend to prefer the doom and gloom endings oftentimes, but I think it's because, like he says, it's harder to write a good happy ending that's convincing. And so I think maybe that's my issue with happy endings. It's not that I don't like things to end well. Maybe a lot of authors just aren't able to do it in a believable way. And so it's easier to just write a downer of an ending. So I never even considered that. So I thought that was really interesting. But then I also like hearing authors talk about how a character takes on a life of their own, like the way we hear Ben does, by not turning out the way King had intended him to. But then I also wanted to share how this book was reminding me a lot of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which I covered just a few months ago. I love that book. I love both of the adaptations that were made. And I don't know if King intentionally was bringing elements of that into this book along with Dracula, or maybe I'm just seeing Invasion of the Body Snatchers in this due to the fact that it's still fairly fresh in my mind. But there are a lot of similarities here. For example, both involve a local guy who has moved away from his hometown, but now he is returning. And in both, he falls in love with a local woman. Both have the town being taken over by an otherworldly group. Both have a scene where someone calls up the main character and has them check out a body. Both have scenes where people sit and watch a body to see if anything changes. And both have a group of people who band together, but that group slowly gets smaller and smaller. And we also have the locals that are changing overnight one by one. And both stories can also be symbolic of something bigger. Obviously, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, especially the book and the 50s movie, a lot of people see that as symbolic of McCarthyism and the fear of communism that was being spread at the time. And the story of Salem's Lot could be seen as representing like outside cultures infiltrating this small town and changing their small town ways, or also just the fear of an outsider coming in and exposing the dark side of a seemingly wholesome town. And fear of the outsider is also something that you could see Dracula as being symbolic of, where it represents these English men not liking a foreigner coming to town and taking their English ladies and ruining their pure English bloodlines. But of course, also all three of these stories could also just be a fun horror / sci-fi story that doesn't have a deeper meaning. And yet at the same time, I think that's the beauty of fiction, right? Is a reader can attribute a deeper meaning to it if they want to, even if the author hadn't intended it. So I don't see anything wrong with people digging deeper into something, because sometimes other people will comment being like, that's not what the author meant, like you're just take it as face value, you're looking for something that isn't there, yada yada yada. But if people want to find a deeper meaning, even if it's not what the author intended, I don't see anything wrong with that personally. But I also wanted to talk about how with King, one of the things that make his scary scenes so scary is the way he describes the fear the characters feel. It's so real and relatable and puts you in their shoes and makes the story all the more terrifying. And one scene in particular that stands out in this book is when the two men pick up the large crate from the dock and they take it to the Marston house, and unbeknownst to them, the box contains Barlow, and they can sense like these bad evil vibes coming from this, and they have to take it into the Marston cellar at night. And so both of these men are on edge and jittery and scared, to say the least. And so what makes this scene so tense and frightening, it's not just the premise, but it's the way King describes the fear these men feel, right? And I think that's also something I never really considered until I read this book, how King can sell a scary scene, not only because he's creating a scary scene, but he sells it when he describes the fear the characters within the scene feel. Like he describes fear so well. And yeah, you really feel it at different moments in this book. But then I also love in the book how we get these different interludes, like from the perspective of the town kind of. And so Salem's Lot is its own character in this book. And I actually want to share some different excerpts we get about the town. The town knew about darkness. It knew about the darkness that comes on the land when rotation hides the land from the sun, and about the darkness of the human soul. The town is an accumulation of these parts, which in some are greater than the sections. The town is the people who live there, the buildings which they have erected to den or to do business in, and it is the land. It sees through your lies, even the ones you tell yourself. Being in town is a daily act of utter intercourse so complete that it makes what you and your wife do in the squeaky bed look like a handshake. Being in the town is prosaic, sensuous, alcoholic. And in the dark, the town is yours and you are the town's, and together you sleep like the dead, like the very stones in your north field. There is no life here but the slow death of days. And so when the evil falls on the town, its coming seems almost preordained, sweet and morphic. It is almost as though the town knows the evil was coming and the shape it would take. The town has its secrets and keeps them well. The people don't know them at all. And so like I touched on in my previous video, the 2004 adaptation tries to show this aspect of the book more than the other adaptations do, I would say, highlighting how these small town folk actually have these dark, sinister secrets, and this town is harboring its own kind of evil, which makes it susceptible to Barlow taking over. And the 2004 version, as in the book, also shows that it is the greed of the local realtor that allows Barlow to come into the town as well, because Straker/Barlow, they make a deal with him that is too good to be true, which greedy Larry Crockett can't resist. And so Barlow is using the weakness of one of the town members in order to gain entry. And yeah, this current 2024 movie does not delve into this aspect of the story at all. I mean, there's a scene when they're at the drive-in and Susan is pointing out different secrets amongst the town members, but it really didn't convey it the way the book did. But to move right on to the movie now, so the movie does cut a lot from the book, which is to be expected, right, in order for it to fit into this runtime. And we do begin the movie with Ben showing up in town, and it ends with Ben and Mark leaving town. So I did love that change, because in the book and the other adaptations, I didn't love it beginning with the end and how like the story is bookended in that way. I personally was not a fan, even in the book. And so I was happy that this adaptation just gets right to it. But even before Ben shows up, the very first scene of the movie is that scene I referenced earlier from the book where the men go pick up the box which contains Barlow and they take it into the Marston house. And I thought this was a great scene to begin with, and it was creepy in the movie. And as they are leaving, we see like a brief glimpse of Barlow, and yeah, I thought that was very creepy and effective, and I did think this was a good opening scene. But I guess I will just address Barlow and Straker first, since I already touched on Barlow just now. But in the book, Barlow looks human. Remember, Stephen King was inspired by Dracula, and in Dracula, he looks relatively human, and so that is the same here, where Barlow looks like a human. But this adaptation kind of goes in the route the 79 version did, where they make Barlow a creepy, non-human looking vampire. And in the 79 version, Barlow, his makeup looked so good, the effects, like he was so creepy. Whereas here, I didn't think he looked that scary. I feel like it worked the best when we just got glimpses, like that first scene early on I mentioned, or there's a part when Straker brings Ralphie as a sacrifice to Barlow, and we get this long shot of Barlow from a distance, and I thought that was great. But then, as the movie goes on and we actually get like a close-up glimpse of Barlow, he just looked way too CGI'd, and I just didn't find him scary. And also, once the people turn into vampires, I didn't find them scary either. And so in general, I think the 79 movie was the best with the effects and the makeup. And then Straker here, he is Barlow's human assistant. And yeah, he actually wasn't in too much of this movie, but what he was in, he was fine. And it was similar to the book, right? Like he's this guy who is able to charm the town initially. But yeah, he is there to help Barlow out. And eventually he ends up being killed by Mark. And then I did want to mention the scene when Straker gets Ralphie as a sacrifice, because yeah, in the movie, he brings Ralphie to Barlow as a sacrifice. And then after this, Barlow then goes to see Ralphie's brother, Danny, and he bites Danny. And then Danny ends up becoming a vampire. Whereas in the book, I don't think he was sacrificing Ralphie to Barlow. I think he was sacrificing him to some higher entity that they needed to appease in order for Barlow to come to Salem's Lot. I'm not entirely sure, but that's what it seemed like to me. So let me know your thoughts on that down below in the comments. But I did like this scene in the movie though. Like I said, I did think it was one of the creepier moments. And so yeah, Danny, who had been Ralphie's brother, he ends up being bit by Barlow and turned into a vampire, like I said. But before he becomes a vampire, he first dies. And so they have a funeral for him. And we get the graveyard scene when Mike is burying Danny's coffin, but he ends up getting hypnotized and he opens the coffin and then he is bit by Danny. And this scene in the book was so tense and suspenseful and creepy. And the movie here just did not quite capture it the way it was described in the book. But in both, Burke, a local school teacher, sees Mike looking sick after he has been bit and has Mike stay at his house in order to look after him. However, in the night, a vampire comes in and finishes Mike off, and then the next day, his body is sent to the morgue. And in both, Mike, of course, turns into a vampire, and he later returns to Burke's house. And in both, Burke, he revokes his invitation, which causes Mike to go away. Also, he has a cross. But in the book, Burke then has a heart attack and he spends the rest of the story in the hospital before ultimately dying. Whereas here, he is tossed around a bit, but he seems okay after his interaction with Mike. And from here, Burke is then the one that goes to the Marston house and he comes across Mark, who is also sneaking in. And this was a huge change from the book, because in the book, it was Susan who was sneaking in and comes across Mark. And so in the book, Susan is then captured and bit by Barlow and turned into a vampire. Whereas in the movie, it is Burke. And during the daytime, the group comes to the Marston house and they then kill Burke here in this movie. And so yeah, Burke, he is not around long. And I might have my complaints with Susan being the first of the main group to die in the book, but I loved that she was the one who was going into the Marston house. And so I did not like the movie making this change. And you know, Susan being turned early on, this is another reference to Dracula, where one of the women in the story are the first to become a vampire, and the man who is in love with her is the one who has to be the one to kill her. And so that is the case in the book Salem's Lot 2. They come back in the daytime and they see Susan sleeping in the coffin, and Ben is the one who has to put a stake through her heart because he is the one who loves her. Although I will say, I get this in reference to Dracula, but later on when they're killing vampires, it doesn't matter who's emotionally attached to who. Like, they're just killing whatever vampires they can. So why in this scene, why were they like, it has to be you, Ben? I feel like when you think about it in relation to the rest of the story, it doesn't quite make sense. But I will say that King does write it as being a very emotional scene. And so yeah, in my previous video, I complain about Susan being the first to die, but I do understand why King did it this way. I just kind of wish he had another woman character in the story. And this movie does have another woman character because in the book, the doctor was a man, whereas here the doctor is a woman. But yeah, so in the movie, Susan does not go to the Marston house. And so it instead is much later in the story when she ends up being turned into a vampire. And so then we get a scene where they find her sleeping in her coffin, which is the trunk of a car. And we start to get a similar scene where Ben is the one who has to kill her. And he's like, you know, overcome with emotion about having to be the one to do this. But then instead, he's like, I can't do this. And the doctor takes over instead. But then the doctor ends up being shot. And so she isn't able to kill Susan. And so ultimately, Ben is still the one who kills her, but she ends up waking up and the two of them have a fight. So he's killing her while they're having this battle between the two of them. And I thought this made her death less emotional because in the book, she was just sleeping in a coffin. She wasn't trying to attack them at all when he had to kill her. And so here they made it more action-packed and more dramatic, and yet it was much less emotional. But then yeah, as far as the doctor goes, so in both book and movie, they end up dying. Like I just said, in the movie, she is shot by like another assistant of Barlow's. Whereas in the book, he dies because Barlow has created this trap with the stairs with all of these knives, which he falls on. And they do not have the stair trap in the movie, which I was disappointed by because I really like that part of the book. But there's a part where they have flashlights and they look in the basement and the stairs are gone, but they can see it. And so they're like, oh, there's no stairs. We need to get a ladder. Whereas in the book, the stairs, partway through, they had cut them off. And so yeah, the doctor just falls off of it and he dies. And so here they remove the stairs and yet they remove the fact that it's a trap because they see that there's no stairs and they just get a ladder. So I kind of missed the stair trap here. But also there's a part in both book and movie where the doctor is bit by a vampire, but then they just use like medical sanitizing solution and they pour it on their neck and it gets rid of the venom. And so it prevents them from turning into a vampire. And I thought that was kind of interesting logic, like just your regular medical sanitizing solution stops you from turning. I feel like it would have made more sense if she poured holy water on her neck. That would have made sense to stop being turned into a vampire. But yeah, her using like her own medical stuff to stop the venom, that does come right from the book. But yeah, I kind of didn't like it in book or movie. But I need to talk about Mark, of course, because he is one of the best parts of this book and movie. In fact, in the movie, he is my favorite character here. In the book, I like a lot of the characters, but Mark is definitely up there. And here, like I said, in the movie, he is one of the best parts of this movie, and his portrayal here is very similar to the way Mark is written in the book. And they do have him be book age, which is around 12 years old, and the other adaptations, they aged him up. But yeah, as in the book, he loves all things horror and therefore knows the Dracula lore and is able to stop the boy vampire from biting him. And yeah, he is there up until the very end, helping get rid of and the other vampires, and he is there with Ben when they leave town. And again, he's just an awesome character in both book and all the movies. Although the 2004 version, that is my least favorite Mark, but the book and the 79 version and this one here, Mark is amazing. And yeah, like I said, he sneaks into the Marston house. In the book, he runs into Susan. In the movie, he runs into Burke. But in both, he is also caught, but he is tied up, but he escapes the ties. And then he runs to meet up with Ben and the others because because Susan's like told him that she was connected to Ben and they were, checking out this vampire theory. And so that is why he knows to go seek Ben out. Although in the movie, he just is going to the church for holy water and they just happen to be there. So I guess in the movie, he wasn't seeking them out. It was just coincidence. But yeah, that is when he teams up with the rest of them. And then Callahan here, he is similar to the book as well. He is the local Catholic priest who is getting older and weary and who is also an alcoholic. And in both versions, he faces off with Barlow, but the religious emblems only work if you have faith. And this is very explicit in the book. We hear this, that you have to have faith in order for these to have power. And while holding up the cross to Barlow, Callahan loses faith and therefore has no power against Barlow. And in the book, Barlow makes Callahan drink Barlow's own blood, which then causes Callahan to kind of go he becomes in a daze and he goes to a bus station and gets on a bus and leaves town. Whereas in the movie, he loses against Barlow, but here Barlow just kills him. And I originally thought that Callahan didn't have enough faith in his religion and his God, and that is why the cross loses its power. But now I actually think that he didn't have faith in himself. Like, he believed in his religion, but he had such low self-esteem, in part due to his alcoholism, that he felt unworthy. And I think that is why the cross loses power, because we know he takes his role as a priest very seriously. And why would he take it seriously if he didn't believe in it? So yeah, I think it makes more sense that he lost faith in himself and in his own power, and that's what causes him to fail. But King writes about Callahan in the author's note when he's talking about the skepticism of the town in the modern day, and we read, "Even Father Callahan, the man of God, cannot really believe in Mr. Barlow. No, not even when the evidence appears before his very eyes. And so Callahan is sent hence into the land of Nod, which lies east of Eden. In Salem's lot, Detroit serves as a stand-in for Nod." And in the Bible, Nod represents a place away from the face of God where those who forsake God are sent. And so Callahan forsook his own God by thinking he wasn't worthy. And so you could see him being sent away for that reason. I'm not entirely sure, as you can tell, as far as Callahan in the book. Like I said, I think it makes sense that he lost faith in himself and he didn't have the confidence. But then also, based on what King says, I guess Callahan also lost faith in Barlow and not believing what was in front of his very eyes. And so he was cast out because he didn't believe in Barlow, who could be seen as this new God. But yeah, I'm very curious, if you've read the book, what did you make of Barlow and this whole interaction and him leaving Salem's lot? Let me know down in the comments. But in the book, we learn much more about the Marston house and how it was owned by Hugh B. Marston, who killed his wife and then himself. And he was also laying the groundwork for Barlow to eventually return because he had this correspondence with this person in Europe. The person had a different name, but we can assume it was Barlow, just going by a different name. And then now, even though Hugh B. Marston is dead, it seems like the house still has this festering evil within it. And the house is also up on a hill overlooking the town. The town is constantly in the shadow of the presence of this evil house. And the movie also does not have the fact that when Ben was a kid, he snuck into the Marston house and he saw the ghost of Hugh B. Marston's dead body and it opened its eyes to look at him. So the movie doesn't have that at all, which I was pretty surprised that they cut that. But then also in the book, in 1951, we hear about a fire that happens in Salem's lot. And in the book we read, they know that a fire burned up half the town in that smoke-haze September of 1951, but they don't know that it was set. And they don't know that the boy who set it graduated valedictorian of his class in 1953 and went on to make $100,000 on Wall Street. And even if they had known, they would not have known the compulsion that drove him to it or the way it ate at his mind for the next 20 years of his life until a brain embolism hustled him into the grave at the age of 46. And then in the book, in present day, Ben and Mark, they kill Barlow and then they actually leave town only to then return a year later because even though Barlow is dead, the vampires are still around. And so when they come back, they set the town on fire and they talk about how fire purifies. So they are burning Salem's lot so that it can be made pure from the evil of these vampires. And so with that in mind, I guess the 1951 fire was also set by someone who knew the evil that was going on and did it in order to purify it. But I feel like the book isn't very clear. Like the 51 fire comes up so often in the book, and yet yeah, I guess I was wanting a bit more details as to who and why this fire happened. But again, I'm assuming it's for purification reasons, the same reason Ben and Mark set the fire. So again, let me know your thoughts on that part of the book down below in the comments. But yeah, in the end of the movie, they kill Barlow and they are able to kill all of the vampires by letting the sun hit them, which seemed too easy. Like all of the vampires are sleeping in the drive-in movie lot, which made it very easy to just get them all in one go. Whereas in the book, they were scattered throughout all of town. And so it was a daunting task to try to find each and every one of them, Whereas, yeah, at the end of the movie, they kill each and every one of them pretty easily. And then Ben and Mark leave town, but the movie does not have them setting the town on fire. And so when it comes to book versus movie, the movie, like I said, it has its moments. A lot of scenes early on I did think were effective and creepy, but then it just kind of went downhill and I ultimately was disappointed. And along with it just not being scary and along with the CGI just not being very good, the movie I just found to be kind of dull, which it's funny because they cut out like all of the town drama and they just get right to the vampire action in many ways. And yet I was not very invested in the story and I was not pulled in, and it almost just felt kind of boring at times. And the performances were fine, but aside from Mark, everything and everyone about this movie was kind of forgettable. And I do like the actor who plays the doctor. I forget her name now, but I do like her. But yeah, ultimately, there was nothing about this movie that will stand out in my mind for years to come. I feel like even the 2004 version made more of an impression on me than this one did. And that's really saying something because I didn't particularly love that one either. I just thought that one was okay. But maybe I'm being too harsh. Let me know down in the comments if you did like this movie. Let me know what you did like about it. I did go into it feeling hopeful and with an open mind. So it's not like I went into it like expecting to dislike it or something, right? Like I wanted to like it. But yeah, like I said, it doesn't hold up well as an adaptation of Salem's Lot. And in my mind, it also doesn't hold up well just as a vampire horror movie. So when it comes to book versus movie, it's no surprise that the book wins. The book I thought was much scarier. It was much more suspenseful. I was much more attached to the characters. Susan and Ben's relationship, I felt so much more in the book, whereas in the movie, I was not feeling their connection. Like the two actors, their chemistry was fine, but I wasn't really buying their romance the way I bought it in the book. And yeah, that wraps it up on Salem's Lot. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. Again, if you liked this movie, comment down below and let me know. But also, if you like me, I just don't understand why this adaptation was made, right? Like, if you're going to adapt this for the third time, like at least have a reason for adapting it, right? But they're adapting it in a way that's worse than the others because they cut so much. And then even what they kept just didn't really land, in my opinion. So why did they even feel the need to remake this book in particular when they couldn't even do it right, But anyway, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you have not already. And I will see you next time. Bye.